For decades, fear ruled the streets of El Salvador. It wasn't the kind of fear that arrives with a sudden disaster. It was slower, heavier, woven into daily life. Shopkeepers paid rent to gangs just to keep their doors open. Bus drivers memorized invisible borders that determined whether they lived or died. Children learned to run before they learned to read, darting across streets controlled by rival factions. Entire neighborhoods existed as open-air prisons, ruled not by law but by gang codes. Two names carried the most terror: MS-13 and Barrio 18. They were more than gangs. They were parallel governments, collecting taxes, enforcing curfews, deciding who could live where, who could work, who could love. Refusal meant disappearance. Disrespect meant execution. Crossing an invisible boundary could be a death sentence. By the late 2010s, El Salvador had one of the highest homicide rates in the world. Bodies appeared in alleys at dawn. Families identified loved ones by tattoos, scars, or clothing. Police were outnumbered, outgunned, and often too afraid to intervene. Many believed the country was beyond saving. Then in 2019, a young, unconventional leader took office: Nayib Bukele. He didn't look like the presidents people were used to. No gray suits. No rehearsed speeches. He wore backward baseball caps, posted directly to social media, and spoke to citizens without intermediaries. Critics dismissed him as a showman. Supporters saw something different, someone unafraid to confront what others had tolerated. Bukele inherited a nation exhausted by violence. Previous governments had tried negotiations, truces, and partial crackdowns. None worked. Gangs grew stronger. Fear deepened. Bukele chose a different path. He declared that the era of coexistence with terror was over. At first, the world watched with skepticism. Could one administration dismantle a criminal network that had embedded itself into the fabric of society? Could a government reclaim neighborhoods where even ambulances hesitated to enter? The answer began to unfold in March 2022. That month, a surge of gang killings shocked the country, dozens murdered in a single weekend. The violence was a message: the gangs still held power. But the response they received was unlike anything in El Salvador's history. A state of emergency was declared. Constitutional protections were suspended. Security forces were unleashed with a single mission: dismantle the gangs completely. Police and soldiers flooded communities once considered untouchable. Checkpoints appeared overnight. Intelligence units tracked tattoos, affiliations, and digital footprints. Anyone suspected of gang ties was detained. The arrests came in waves. Hundreds. Then thousands. Then tens of thousands. Within months, more than 60,000 suspected gang members were in custody. Entire command structures collapsed. Streets once ruled by extortion collectors fell silent. Residents who had lived behind locked doors for years stepped outside cautiously, unsure if the quiet was real. For the first time in a generation, children played in neighborhoods that had been battlegrounds. But mass arrests created a new challenge: where to hold so many prisoners. Existing prisons were already overcrowded, some operating at 3 times their intended capacity. Gang leaders had turned them into command centers, issuing orders from behind bars. If the government was serious about ending gang control, it needed a facility designed not for rehabilitation, but for absolute containment. The solution would become one of the most controversial and talked about projects in modern Latin American history: a mega prison. A fortress designed to hold tens of thousands of gang members, cut off from the outside world, unable to communicate, organize, or escape. Construction began in secrecy. Engineers and security experts worked under tight timelines. The facility would be unlike any prison the region had ever seen, built not just to detain criminals, but to dismantle the infrastructure of gang power. When the prison was completed in 2023, it sent a message far beyond El Salvador's borders. This was not a negotiation. This was a declaration of war on organized crime. The facility would come to be known as CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center. It was designed to house up to 40,000 inmates. 8 massive cell blocks. Concrete walls rising 15 meters high. Watchtowers scanning every angle. Motion sensors. Facial recognition systems. Biometric verification. No blind spots. No shadows. Inside, the rules were simple: total control. No visits. No communication with the outside. No privileges. No hierarchy. Members of rival gangs, once locked in violent conflict, were now confined within the same walls, stripped of territory, stripped of power, stripped of identity beyond a number. Supporters called it justice. Critics called it authoritarian. But inside El Salvador, something undeniable was happening. Homicide rates plummeted. Extortion complaints dropped dramatically. Public spaces reopened. Nightlife returned. Tourism, once unthinkable, began to rise. Citizens spoke of a new, unfamiliar feeling: safety. For many, it was the first time in their lives they could walk outside after dark without calculating escape routes. Bukele's approval ratings soared. In 2019 he entered office with modest support. By 2024 he would win re-election in a landslide, backed by a population that credited him with restoring their freedom from fear. Yet beneath the statistics and political victories lay a deeper question. What is the cost of security? Thousands were imprisoned without traditional due process. Families searched for detained relatives. Human rights organizations warned of abuses. The world debated whether El Salvador's transformation was a model to follow, or a dangerous precedent. But inside the country the reality was stark and immediate. The daily terror that had defined life for decades had receded. And at the center of this transformation stood one man, a leader willing to gamble his presidency, his reputation, and his country's democratic norms on a single. That fear could be defeated. That a nation long defined by violence could be rewritten. That gangs which once controlled entire cities could be reduced to silent rows of inmates behind reinforced concrete. This is where our story begins, not inside the prison walls, but in the streets that led to their construction. Streets that witnessed decades of bloodshed, and the radical measures taken to end it. In the next chapter we step beyond the gates of CECOT, into the fortress itself, to see how a prison became the centerpiece of a nation's war on crime. The road to CECOT does not feel like a journey to a prison. It feels like an approach to a military installation, a place designed not merely to confine but to dominate. The highway stretches through dry terrain and open land, the isolation deliberate. There are no neighborhoods nearby, no markets, no homes. Nothing that could provide cover. Nothing that could offer escape. After nearly an hour's drive from the capital, the first signs appear: checkpoints. Armed soldiers stand beside armored vehicles. Identification is checked and rechecked. Cameras mounted on poles track every movement. Visitors are rare and permission to enter is rarer still. The message is clear long before the walls come into view: this is not a place you arrive at by accident. Then, rising from the landscape, the fortress reveals itself. CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, sits behind towering concrete walls topped with coils of razor wire. Watchtowers punctuate the perimeter, each one manned, each one scanning the horizon. From above, the facility resembles a grid of control, every angle calculated, every pathway monitored. It is not designed to blend into the environment. It is designed to overpower it. Inside the outer gate, security procedures begin immediately. The process mirrors an airport but more intense. Metal detectors, full-body scanners, biometric verification. Personal belongings are inspected down to the smallest detail. Clothing is checked. Even socks are examined. Nothing enters without scrutiny. Every door opens only after the previous one seals shut. Airlock security, layer after layer. Each checkpoint reinforces a single truth. Once inside, there is no uncontrolled movement, not for visitors, not for guards, and certainly not for inmates. CECOT is built around 8 massive cell blocks, each capable of holding thousands of prisoners. The scale is difficult to comprehend until standing within its corridors. Concrete stretches in every direction. Steel bars, reinforced doors, and surveillance cameras form a constant, unblinking presence. There are no shadows here. Lights remain on 24 hours a day. Time, morning, afternoon, night, loses meaning. The constant illumination serves two purposes. Guards can monitor inmates at all times, and prisoners are denied the psychological comfort of darkness. Sleep comes in fragments. Awareness never fully fades. Technology plays a central role in control. Facial recognition systems confirm identities. Fingerprint scanners log movement. Motion sensors detect unusual activity. Cameras capture every angle, feeding into a central monitoring hub where officers observe in real time. Most inmates arrive without identification. Tattoos become their records, permanent declarations of gang allegiance. Authorities catalog each marking: numbers, symbols, skulls, graves. Every line of ink tells a story of violence, loyalty, and hierarchy. Inside the cells, that hierarchy no longer exists. Each cell holds up to 100 inmates, though only 80 metal bunks line the walls. Those without beds sleep on bare surfaces. There are no mattresses, no blankets, no personal possessions. A single open toilet sits in the corner, visible to all. Privacy does not exist. Comfort does not exist. The design is intentional, to remove any structure that once allowed gangs to organize. No segregated territories. No leadership tiers. Rival factions that once waged war now occupy the same confined space, stripped of identity beyond uniform and number. Every prisoner wears white. No colors. No symbols. No rank. The tattoos remain, but they no longer command fear, only recognition. Movement is tightly controlled. Prisoners leave their cells for just 30 minutes each day. Exercise consists of bodyweight routines performed under armed supervision. There are no weights, no equipment, no games. The purpose is not recreation. It is containment with minimal physical deterioration. Meals are basic: beans, rice, and water. No meat. No variation. No indulgence. Food is delivered directly to cells. In solitary confinement, even that limited movement disappears. Those placed in isolation spend days in darkness, confined to small, lightless rooms. Meals slide through slots in the door. There is no conversation, no distraction, only silence and time. It is a system designed to break patterns of control, to eliminate influence, to sever communication. Even legal proceedings occur within the prison. Court hearings are conducted via video link. Lawyers appear on screens. Defendants never leave the facility. The outside world exists only as pixels and voices transmitted through monitored systems. CECOT does not transport prisoners to justice. Justice is brought inside the walls. Security extends beyond the inmates. Guards wear face coverings, concealing their identities. The risk of retaliation is real. Gangs have long memories and long reach. Protecting officers and their families is considered essential to maintaining control. More than 600 soldiers and 250 police officers guard the complex. Rotations are strict: 5 days on duty, 5 days off, to maintain vigilance and prevent fatigue. Their living quarters, dining areas, and gym facilities are separate from inmate zones, reinforcing the boundary between authority and confinement. An armory within the complex houses riot gear, non-lethal weapons, and firearms, a visible reminder that any attempt at uprising would be met with overwhelming force. Leg restraints and specialized cuffs line the walls, designed to immobilize prisoners completely if necessary. Escape, officials say, is impossible. The walls are too high. The surveillance too complete. The response too immediate. Yet the most striking aspect of CECOT is not the technology or the architecture. It is the silence. In prisons dominated by gangs, noise is power. Shouting orders, coded messages, territorial chants. Here that noise is absent. Conversations are muted. Movements are cautious. The constant presence of guards and cameras suppresses the dominance rituals that once defined gang culture. For the first time, men who commanded fear across entire cities stand in enforced equality, stripped of command, stripped of territory, stripped of the networks that once made them untouchable. Some stare blankly. Some avoid eye contact. Some glare with the remnants of defiance. And some, according to guards, weep when no one is looking. CECOT is not a place built for redemption stories. There are no workshops, no classrooms, no rehabilitation programs. Its mission is singular: neutralize the operational capacity of gangs. Supporters argue that this is precisely why it works. By removing the ability to communicate, recruit, and coordinate, the prison dismantles gang infrastructure at its core. Leaders cannot issue orders. Members cannot enforce territory. The chain of command collapses into isolated individuals. Critics argue that such a system sacrifices human rights for security. But inside El Salvador, many citizens measure the prison's value not in legal frameworks, but in lived experience. The ability to open a business without extortion, to ride a bus without crossing gang lines, to let children walk to school without fear. CECOT stands as both symbol and instrument, a fortress representing the state's absolute refusal to cede control to criminal organizations. Yet the deeper story lies not only within its walls, but in the lives that led its inmates there. Childhood shaped by poverty, recruitment at young ages, cycles of violence that turn neighborhoods into war zones. Inside CECOT, identity has been stripped down to numbers, white uniforms, and ink burned into skin. The tattoos remain, stretching across faces, necks, and chests, permanent declarations of loyalty that no prison can erase. Skulls, numbers, graves, names of fallen members. Symbols that once inspired fear across entire neighborhoods now sit in silence, telling stories without a single word. Each mark is a record of a life shaped by violence. And for many of the men inside, that story began in childhood. In the poorest communities of El Salvador, Recruitment often started before adolescence. Boys barely old enough to understand loyalty were watched, tested, and slowly drawn in. At 10 or 11, some were given simple tasks: carry messages, deliver packages, watch for police. Refusal was dangerous. Gangs offered protection, belonging, and identity in places where families were fractured and opportunities were scarce. What they demanded in return was absolute loyalty. By their early teens, many recruits had committed their first violent act. By adulthood, leaving was no longer an option. Inside CECOT, one inmate described joining a gang at 11 years old. He said he thought he had found a family. Years later, he realized he had entered a life that would end in a cell or a grave. Before their imprisonment, gangs functioned like governments. Invisible borders cut through cities. Crossing the wrong street could mean death. Taxi drivers refused fares into rival zones. Delivery trucks stopped at gang lines. Entire communities lived according to rules enforced not by law, but by fear. Violence was not random. It was a message. Bodies left in public places were warnings. Extortion payments were tracked with precision. Those who refused to pay were punished in ways meant to be seen. Inside the prison, guards recount the crimes that brought many inmates here. Multiple murders, kidnappings, extortion networks, human trafficking. Some prisoners admit to killing in double digits. Others remain silent, their tattoos speaking for them. One inmate murdered 5 people for crossing into territory he controlled. Another kidnapped 4 victims. A third killed a young athlete, a crime that shocked the nation not only for its brutality, but for the future it erased. These are not isolated stories. They are fragments of a system that normalized violence as a form of governance. Gangs did not rely only on weapons. They ruled through psychology. Residents paid extortion not because they could afford it, but because they feared the consequences of refusal. Children avoided eye contact with tattooed men. Shopkeepers memorized footsteps. Entire neighborhoods learned to read danger in silence. Fear became routine. CECOT was designed to reverse that reality. Inside these walls, the men who once projected fear now live under constant surveillance. The lights never turn off. Guards outnumber leaders. Movement is restricted. Communication is monitored. The tools of intimidation, secrecy, surprise, and spectacle no longer exist. Some inmates remain defiant. Others withdraw into silence. And some express regret. One prisoner, convicted of killing more than 30 people, reportedly wept during an interview. He spoke about joining as a child, committing violence to survive, and realizing too late that survival had cost him his humanity. But regret does not erase consequences. Inside CECOT, remorse does not open doors. Beyond the prison walls, another group carries the weight of gang life: families. Mothers search detention lists for their sons' names. Wives raise children alone. Parents struggle to reconcile love with the crimes committed. Some insist their relatives were wrongfully arrested. Others mourn the paths that led them into violence. In neighborhoods once ruled by gangs, daily life has changed. Extortion demands have disappeared. Nighttime gunfire has faded. Businesses remain open after dark. Yet poverty remains, and the scars of decades of fear are slow to heal. Children who grew up surrounded by violence must now learn how to live without it. The question is whether opportunity will replace recruitment. Under President Nayib Bukele, the country has undergone a dramatic transformation. Homicide rates have dropped. Public spaces have reopened. Citizens describe a freedom they had never known. Supporters call it liberation. Critics call it dangerous. The world continues to watch. Is this a model for defeating organized crime? Or a warning about the cost of security? Inside CECOT, the answer feels both immediate and incomplete. The prison has neutralized thousands of gang members and dismantled networks that once controlled entire cities. But it cannot erase the conditions that allowed gangs to flourish: poverty, exclusion, lack of education, and the human need for belonging. A prison can confine violence. It cannot prevent its return. In neighborhoods once dominated by gangs, silence now carries a different meaning. It is no longer the tense quiet before gunfire, but the unfamiliar calm of safety. Children play soccer in streets that were once battle lines. Vendors stay open past sunset. Buses travel routes that drivers once feared. For many, this silence is relief. For others, it is uncertainty, a pause in a story not yet finished. Because the systems that produced gang life still exist beyond the walls. CECOT stands as a fortress, a symbol, and a warning. It represents a nation's refusal to surrender to fear. It demonstrates the power of decisive action. And it reveals the human cost of cycles left unchecked for generations. The men inside are no longer rulers of the streets. They are reminders of what fear can build, of what desperation can create, and of what a nation must confront if it hopes to ensure that the next generation never trades a future for a tattoo.